In May 1940, Europe watched in shock as one of its strongest military powers collapsed almost overnight. France, one of the most powerful countries in Europe, had a bigger army than Germany. It had more tanks, more soldiers, and stronger defenses like the famous Maginot Line that stretched across the border like a concrete giant. French commanders believed it was impossible for Germany to break through. Many even believed the war would turn into another long, slow stalemate like World War I. But they thought wrong because in just 6 weeks, France fell. Yes, Paris was occupied by the Nazis and the French government shamefully fled. The country that once ruled Europe was forced to surrender. So how did a nation that looked so strong on paper lose so fast in real life? This is the story of bad planning, false confidence, slow decisions, and one bold German gamble that changed history forever. Following Germany's invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, officially beginning World War II. The British military commanders expected a rapid attack towards France, so they sent the British Expeditionary Force to help defend France and Belgium over the winter. However, there was no sign of attack from Germany. In fact, throughout the winter period, there was no fighting, and the Allied forces spent this time shoring up their defenses. This period became known as the Phony War. Now, at the start of 1940, France did not look like a country that was about to lose. On paper, the French army was one of the biggest in the world. It had over 5 million trained soldiers when fully mobilized. It had more tanks than Germany. It had strong artillery and, of course, allies. But most important of all, it had the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was a massive chain of underground forts built after World War I. It stretched along France's eastern border facing Germany. These were not simple bunkers. They were deep underground cities made of concrete and steel. They had sleeping quarters, hospitals, food storage, rail systems, and heavy guns that could fire for miles. The French government spent billions building this line. To the people of France, it felt like an unbreakable wall and a shield that would protect them from another German invasion. And in many ways, the line really was strong. But the problem was not the wall, it was the thinking behind it. You see, the French generals believed the next war would be fought like the last one. They expected slow movement, trench warfare, and long battles of position. They believed Germany would once again attack straight through the main border and crash directly into the Maginot Line. So they planned everything around that idea. They built their strongest defenses in the east and placed many of their best troops behind the Maginot Line. Basically, they prepared for a slow, defensive war. Meanwhile, their northern border, the one shared with Belgium and the Ardennes forest, was treated as less important. The Ardennes was thick, hilly, and full of narrow roads, and the French commanders believed tanks could never move through it in large numbers. They thought nature itself was their defense. It was this belief that would destroy them. Now, while France was preparing for a slow war, Germany was planning a fast one. You see, during the period of the Phony War, Adolf Hitler developed a military strategy for victory. The German army had learned harsh lessons from World War I. They knew slow warfare led to exhaustion and defeat, so they built a new way of fighting called Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war. What this means is that this strategy relied upon the German forces striking as fast as possible with as much power as possible to overwhelm the defenders and keep them retreating. So, instead of slow movement, they focused on speed. Instead of long battles, they focused on shock. And instead of waiting, they focused on striking first and striking fast. Basically, Germany rebuilt its army around tanks, planes, radios, and rapid movement. Their commanders were trained to move without waiting for long orders, and units were taught to act fast and change plans on the move. So, while France built walls, Germany built momentum, and by the spring of 1940, everything was ready. On the morning of May 10, 1940, the war exploded into motion. German planes roared over the skies of Western Europe. Paratroopers dropped from the clouds and tanks rolled forward. In a single day, Germany invaded 3 countries at once: the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. To the French and British commanders, this looked exactly like what they had expected. For months, their war plan had been simple. If Germany attacked through Belgium, French and British forces would rush north to meet them. That way, the war would be fought far away from French cities and farms. This meant that Belgium would become the battlefield, not France. So when the invasion came, French generals felt confident. "This is it," they said. Their best armies were immediately moved north into Belgium. Hundreds of thousands of French and British soldiers advanced forward, just as planned. British tanks rolled beside French infantry. The Allies believed they were moving toward the decisive battle, but what they didn't know was that this was exactly what Germany wanted them to think. What they didn't know was that the German attack through Belgium was not the real strike. It was actually a bait. While Allied forces rushed north, something far more dangerous was happening farther south in the one place France believed was safe, the Ardennes forest. German tanks began pouring into the dense woods that French commanders had ignored. And yes, the roads were narrow, trees were thick, and the terrain was rough. On paper, it looked impossible for a massive armored force to pass through, but Germany had taken the risk. Thousands of tanks crept through narrow mountain roads, bumper to bumper. Now, if the French had bombed these roads at the right moment, the entire German force could have been trapped and destroyed. But the French did not believe such a thing was happening. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. On May 12th, German tanks burst out of the Ardennes and smashed into weak French defenses near the Meuse River. The French troops there were undertrained reserve units. They were shocked by the speed and the violence of the attack. German planes bombed their positions, artillery pounded their lines, and tanks crossed the river. Within days, the German army achieved something the French believed impossible. They broke through. And now, the German tanks were behind the main French and British armies that had rushed into Belgium. The Allies were moving in one direction, while the Germans were racing behind them in another. The trap was closing, and the French command system began to fall apart. As German tanks pushed deeper into France, confusion spread through the French command like wildfire. At first, many French generals refused to believe the reports. They thought the breakthrough in the Ardennes was only a small raid. Some believed it would be contained within days. Others thought the real attack was still happening in Belgium. But hour by hour, the truth became impossible to ignore. German tanks were moving fast. They were cutting through roads, supply lines, and communication networks. French units were being bypassed, surrounded, and isolated. Some soldiers went days without knowing where the enemy was or where their own commanders were. It was clear that while the French army had many soldiers, it did not move as one body. It moved in pieces. Orders had to pass through long chains of command. So, by the time one order reached the front, the situation had already changed. Meanwhile, German commanders, on the other hand, who were leading from the front, had to make decisions in minutes, not days. This difference was deadly. Inside French headquarters, arguments broke out. One general blamed another, some wanted to retreat and others wanted to attack. Basically, no one agreed on the next move. And at the top of it all was a leadership that had lost its nerve. The French commander-in-chief was old. Many of his top officers were veterans of World War I. They had spent their lives preparing for a slow, defensive war. Now they were facing something completely new, and they did not know how to stop it. Meanwhile, German tanks reached the French city of Sedan, a key crossing point on the Meuse River. When the defenses there collapsed, panic exploded across the French front. Soldiers who had not even seen a German tank yet began to retreat, and rumors began to spread faster than facts. Some units pulled back without orders, while others abandoned equipment just to escape. One may call it cowardice, but the truth is that it was shock, as they never believed that the German forces could break the line. The speed of the German advance broke the mental strength of the army. Within days, German armor had raced hundreds of kilometers across northern France, and then they reached the English Channel on May 20th, 1940. This single move split the Allied forces in two. The British and many French units were now trapped in the north, cut off from the rest of France. The trap had fully closed. The two Nazi forces began to move towards the Allies from both directions, hoping to surround them and force them to surrender. This is what is called a pincer movement. As for the Allied forces, they continued to withdraw from the two enemy armies and made their way to the coastline, where they hoped some ships would be able to evacuate some men before they surrendered. By the 26th of May, All the key French and Belgian ports such as Calais had been captured by Germany, except for Dunkirk. And that was where more than 400,000 Allied soldiers who were running out of food, ammunition and hope decided to head over to. By late May 1940, the situation in northern France had collapsed completely. German forces had sliced through the Ardennes, reached the sea, and sealed off the British and French armies in a pocket near the coast. What had once been a powerful Allied force was now surrounded, exhausted, and rapidly shrinking. For many soldiers, the war felt over. But the British had one final chance, a desperate evacuation through the small port of Dunkirk. The beaches were crowded with tens of thousands of men. Some had been marching for days, hungry, dirty, and shaken by the speed of the German advance. Others had fought non-stop and had lost most of their units. They waited, staring at the sea, hoping for rescue, but preparing to die. Behind them, the Germans were closing in. And yet, something unexpected happened. Hitler ordered his tanks to stop. For nearly 3 days, the German armored divisions were halted just a few kilometers away from the trapped Allied troops in Dunkirk. To this day, historians debate the reason for this decision. Some say the ground near Dunkirk was too soft for tanks. Some say Göring convinced Hitler that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, could finish the job alone. Others believe Hitler hoped the British would agree to peace if their army survived. Whatever the reason, that pause changed history. Because during those 3 days, the British launched Operation Dynamo, proposed by Winston Churchill, who had just been appointed as the new Prime Minister of the UK. It turned out to be one of the most extraordinary evacuations ever attempted. Churchill had realized that the entire British and French armies were on the verge of surrender, so he came up with a plan to save as many as possible. Called Operation Dynamo, this plan involved using every ship available to save as many soldiers as possible. It was to be coordinated by the Royal Navy's Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay. And so it began. Warships, fishing boats, yachts, ferries, anything that could float, sailed across the English Channel to help. Civilians who had never seen battle steered their boats into a war zone to save soldiers they had never met. For 9 days, as German planes bombed the beaches and the harbor, massive evacuation continued day and night. Lines of soldiers stood waist-deep in the water, waiting for hours as boats ferried them from the beach to larger ships offshore. Some boats were sunk before they could even load their first passenger, while others managed to make dozens of dangerous trips, dodging bombs and machine gun fire. By the time it was over, more than 338,000 Allied soldiers had been evacuated. It was a miracle of survival, but also a sign of total defeat. Because even though the British escaped, France was now left alone to face the full power of Germany. Meanwhile, the French army was already collapsing across multiple fronts. The government was losing control. Generals were begging for reinforcements that no longer existed, and German forces were preparing for the final push toward Paris. It was clear that the fall of France was no longer a possibility. It was now a countdown. By early June 1940, the war had reached the heart of France. German forces were no longer just breaking through defenses. They were flooding across the country like a fast-moving tide. Towns fell in days, some even in hours. Refugees packed the roads, pushing carts, carrying children, dragging whatever they could save behind them. Entire families slept in fields. Trains were overloaded. Cars ran out of fuel and were abandoned. The French army was still fighting in many places, but it was no longer fighting as one united force. Units were scattered, with some having no leaders. Others had no supplies, while many were simply trying to survive. On June 10th, the French government made a painful decision. They left Paris. Ministers, officials, and military commanders fled south as German troops closed in. The capital was declared an open city, meaning it would not be defended, in hopes of avoiding its destruction. 4 days later, on June 14, 1940, German soldiers marched into Paris without firing a single shot. The City of Lights went dark. German flags flew from government buildings. German soldiers paraded down the Champs-Élysées. and French citizens watched in silence from sidewalks and windows, shocked that their capital had fallen so quickly. For many, the moment felt unreal. It was a startling sight. Just 6 weeks earlier, France had been confident, secure behind its armies and walls. Now its greatest city was under enemy control without a battle. Meanwhile, the French government fled again, moving farther south to the city of Bordeaux. Inside government halls, fear ruled every decision. Some leaders wanted to continue fighting from the colonies. Others believed the war was already lost and wanted to save what was left of the nation. But what was clear to everyone was that the French army was in pieces. Paris was gone, and millions of refugees filled the roads. And now France faced a terrible choice: fight on and risk total destruction, or surrender and survive under German control. This decision would come faster than anyone expected. Now, as earlier mentioned, the French leaders were divided on what to do next. One group of leaders believed France should keep fighting. They wanted to move the government to North Africa and continue the war from the colonies with British support. These ones believed that surrender would mean the end of French freedom. However, another group saw things differently. They looked at the ruined army, the occupied capital, and the millions of refugees on the roads. They believed further resistance would only destroy what was left of the country. They wanted to stop the bloodshed immediately, even if it meant surrender. At the center of this decision was an old war hero from World War I, Marshal Philippe Pétain. To many French citizens, Pétain was a living legend. He had once saved France at the Battle of Verdun. Now, at 84 years old, he was called back to lead the government in its darkest hour. On June 16, 1940, Pétain addressed the nation. In a calm, heavy voice, he told the French people that the fighting must stop and said that he would ask Germany for an armistice. To millions listening on the radio, it sounded like the end of everything they had known. The next day, June 17th, France officially asked Germany for terms of surrender. Hitler chose a powerful symbol for the signing. He ordered the agreement to be signed in the same forest railway carriage where Germany had surrendered to France in 1918 after World War I. To Hitler, it was revenge. To the world, it was humiliation. On June 22, 1940, France signed the armistice. The terms were harsh. Germany would occupy the northern half of the country, including Paris. The French army was disarmed. Millions of French soldiers were taken as prisoners of war, and the government was forced to relocate to the town of Vichy, where it became a puppet state that followed German orders. This was how France, one of Europe's greatest powers, fell. Not in years or months, but in just 6 weeks. For the French people, the shock was unbearable. For Germany, it was the greatest victory in its history, and for the world, it was a warning that this war would not be slow, fair, or predictable. Now, when the dust settled and the shock began to fade, one question echoed across the world. How did France fall so fast? The answer lies not in German strength but in French mistakes, layered on top of each other. The first great failure was thinking in the past. You see, French generals were trapped in the memory of World War I. They expected slow movement, long battles, and defensive warfare. They believed strong walls and fixed positions would decide the next war. In contrast, Germany has learned from the past and refused to fight that kind of war. They fought with speed, surprise, and constant movement. While French commanders waited for perfect plans, German commanders acted. The second failure was poor leadership and slow decision-making. French orders moved through long chains of command. A decision made in the morning often reached the front lines at night or not at all. Meanwhile, German officers were trained to make decisions on the spot. They did not wait. Rather, they adapted based on the situation. So, by the time France reacted, the battlefield had already changed. The third failure was bad communication. French units often fought without knowing what was happening around them. Some did not know their flanks were exposed. Others did not know friendly units had already retreated. Radios were scarce, and as such messages were delayed, leading to confusion on the battlefield. The Germans, however, used radios in nearly every tank and unit. Their forces moved like a single living machine. The fourth failure was air power. Germany controlled the skies. Stuka dive bombers smashed bridges, roads, and tank columns. They attacked supply lines and retreating troops. Even when German bombing caused little physical damage, the sound alone broke morale. This made French soldiers run before German tanks even arrived. The fifth failure was false confidence. France believed its army was too strong to fall quickly. Its leaders believed its defenses were too powerful to be bypassed. This confidence created delay. And delay in modern war meant death. So, while Germany gambled everything on speed, France gambled on safety, and Germany's gamble won.